And one of the things that we had over many years is the U.S. Basic Income Network would hold its meetings hosted by the Eastern Economics Association. And a lot of Georgists would also come to EEA. And I met a few of you over the years at some of those meetings. And more, as that went on, the Georgists would come to the basic income sessions, and the basic income folks would go to the Georgist sessions. And it became, instead of two tiny little marginal movements working to transform society, one slightly larger marginal movement working to transform society. But one of the things that we all talked about over those years is that by working together, by talking about a basic income funded through land value taxes and other resource taxes, we have a very powerful argument that can, I believe, engage vast numbers of people, because the basic income is a much easier sell. And you go to someone and say, would you like $1,000 a month as a guaranteed basic income, just for being a citizen? And once we make that presentation, then we can say, oh, by the way, what do you think would be the best way to fund it? And we have an immediate opening to talk about fossil fuel taxes and land value taxes and recapturing the wealth that's been stolen by the top 1%. So I'm happy to be hanging out with you all today, and I have a book, Basic Income Imperative, and look forward to working together as the movement grows and the world is transformed. Thank you.
Can't say fairer than that. Bill Batten.
Those of us that flag certain common words connected with our movement will know very well that which countries are really hot in terms of newspaper articles and studies and so on. Today, there are 3 articles in British newspapers that are really good. One is by a very well-known British statesman named Philip Inman. And I'll just read a couple of sentences from that one first. UK's wealth rises as land values soar by £450 billion in a year. And then it just shows some of the figures and where we can find out more on that article. The next one is an article about a study that will be out shortly, in which Vince Cable. Now, those of us who know who Vince Cable is, he's a leading figure in the Liberal Party and was part of the coalition of the Tories in the last administration. And Vince Cable is a very stalwart land value taxer. And he says, landowners would be taxed instead of tenants under proposals to scrap the rates-based system put forward in a joint report by ex-business secretary Sir Vince Cable and economist Adam Corlett. The move would see landowners taxed instead of businesses. They say it will deliver a huge boost to England's left-behind communities who overwhelmingly backed Brexit in the 2016 referendum. And it goes on. The last article, very quickly, is and I can't remember the paper now. It's the New Statesman. It says that British wealth is concentrated not in property, but in the land underneath. conventional wisdom suggests that the UK has a problem with house prices. After all, they have increased nearly tenfold since 1979, twice the rate of consumer prices. But the reality is that we have a problem with land. And the article goes on to talk about the problem as we know it. But this is just one day in British newspapers. And as David will attest, things are moving fast over there. And we should be watching what's happening in not only England, but Scotland and Ireland as well.
Thank you, Bill. David Driggs?
We're out of time, so be short.
We need to set the
Okay, I just wanted to reinforce a couple of things that several people have said actually, because I've made input with the references that Bill has just made. But in particular, in a recent presentation I made to the All-Party Parliamentary Group on land value capture, which we've been active in promoting, one of the things that came up is, how do you make this popular? How do you get votes in land value taxation? And that's always been the challenge. And the key that I've struck upon, which resonates with things that a couple of people have said here, is drawing attention to how the current tax system increases, just as as was pointed out earlier, to employ a man for an hour, it costs you 2 hours of your time. That's the actual facts in UK numbers. I could illustrate that, but no time. But if you change the tax system, then what that means actually is the price of everything is halved, including all public services and institutions. If the price of everything is halved and you raise anything approaching the same public revenue, now you've got the pool for a basic income, for a citizen's dividend or whatever. But you can only get that if you change the system of taxation. And so, as a vote winner, I'm entirely with what's been said on a couple of fronts here, is that if we really want this to be popular, you've got to attack the existing tax system. Don't just promote land value taxation. Show why it is. And of course the reason why you've got to, the economic reason for a basic income is not to relieve poverty. It's because we have 100% full land enclosure and there is no free land at the margin. Because there's no free land at the margin, even when we collect land value tax, we don't have the profound effect on the level of earnings that we must have. So you've got to reimburse that difference between monopoly rent and the economic rent of land in the form of a citizen's dividends or basic income. That's probably more on the time. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone who shared their thoughts this morning. I'm told we're out of time, so we're going to move right into our first session of the morning.
No, 5 minutes, we just need to set up the stage.
We're going to take 5 minutes, then we're going to move into our session.
Take 1 minute for an addendum.
Okay, 1 minute for an addendum from Wendy.
Take 10, expect 5, and get 3.
Part of what prompted my rant about archives was that I came across in my files a mimeograph of a 1951 talk by Frank Lloyd Wright at Henry George School, Chicago, School of Commerce and Industry Division. And I knew that he had said things about Broadacre and some things in Disappearing City back in the 30s. Well, here was 1951. Well, and I don't know that anybody else is aware of this talk.
Stand behind me.
And finally, I discovered that part of how he knew George was that his woman who would become his first wife apparently translated P&P into French for a Parisian journal. Go figure. That was 1914 or 15.
Wow.
principles over subsidiarity, which means that things be done at the lowest level that can be done. And in particular, as we try to maybe deal with state governments that are reluctant to give power to cities to tax as the city sees fit, I said the other day about asking the right questions. One of the questions would be to people like that, which tend to be probably on the right, is why do you believe in states' rights? And typically the answer would be, well, it's closer to the people rather than the federal government, it's more personal. Well, then you could ask, well, then shouldn't also the cities also have that lower level, that level of decision for themselves? That's all I wanted to say.
Yeah. Well, while I'm waiting for somebody else to come up, in Philadelphia and many other cities, I think Detroit would be another one, where the state bailed out the city. They have a overseer, a group of people who oversee the city, and they need permission to tax things and so on because they're funding the bills.
Yeah.
But that's just the way governments work, I suppose. That the counties and cities are subordinate to the state. That sounds like, well, it doesn't sound like it's working.
It's on, might need to turn that one up a little.
It's working quite well.
You can't hear it up there, but we can hear it here.
Oh, good, great. So who's gonna be our first contestant here? Good morning. Herb Barry, you're up. You're on for 5 minutes.
Okay. I'm glad to see you again, Rob. Good to see. It's good to see you.
I'm Herb Barry from Pittsburgh. I greatly commend the efforts by Joshua Vincent and others to persuade municipalities or states to switch taxes from buildings to land, so that taxes higher on the land and lower on the buildings. And in fact, I have participated with Dan Sullivan in some of those efforts. But I think that the main value of this is that it will help to lead up to a federal tax on land. And the federal government, it was created as very much a states' rights document, so that the federal government was forbidden to tax individuals within a state. As a consequence of this, there's no real estate tax by the federal government. There's no sales tax by the federal government, because that's taxing individuals within a state. And for most of the history, there was no tax on income. But as the federal land grants, the federal lands became scarcer and then disappeared, the entire territory of the United States became states. And a constitutional amendment, it's the 16th Amendment, was enacted. It was enacted in 1913 to permit the federal government to tax individuals' incomes. And since then, that's been the dominant source of funds for the federal government. And it's so contrary to this lapel button that Bill Batt designed, tax bads, not goods, because most income is salaries or wages, and that's a good that's being taxed. and it's much preferable to tax bads and not goods. And there is a bad that that a very small proportion of the population of the United States owns more than half of the valuable land, especially within the big cities, but throughout the country. There is a very small proportion of wealthy individuals and corporations that own more than half of the land. And so what is needed really is
Is that area or value?
Huh?
Is that area or value
Value.
that they own?
Oh, I'm referring to the value of the land, yeah. And so what I think what is really needed is a federal tax on land, and that requires a constitutional amendment. The 16th Amendment, ratified in 1913, stated that income from any sources could be taxed by the federal government. Some new information that I have beyond last year is that I have submitted a manuscript to a journal. The journal, the name of the journal is the Journal of Psycho. The Journal of Psychohistory. Psychohistory. It's a specialized topic, and the journal has rather small circulation, but the editor of the journal has sent it to reviewers. I submitted it earlier this month, and I hope that it will be published. The title of my manuscript is Cause and Potential Prevention of Periodic National Financial Contractions. There have been very many of these financial contractions. They're all very bad and devastating for the victims of them. And so the cause is that the federal government has no tax on land. And so my proposal is a constitutional amendment, which is very similar in wording to the 16th Amendment that was ratified in 1913. And the proposed text of this amendment, Dan Sullivan helped with
Can we give
the
him a few
wording
more
of it.
minutes? Is that all right with everybody?
Yeah, Dan Sullivan helped with the wording of this, and there's a few words that have been added to what I talked about last year, but probably none of you has heard my, or none of you remembers my open mic speeches last year. And so the proposed wording of this constitutional amendment is the following. The Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes on the value of unimproved territory paid by its individual and corporate owners. The value of buildings constructed by humans, and then a few new items, crops, trees, and other growths shall be exempt from this tax. The Department of the Interior shall assess this revenue to be sufficiently accurate and recent. So an amendment to the federal constitution is a difficult task, and it may require, it'll certainly require more than a year or two for it to occur, but this is a good time to be advocating and for us Georgians all to unite in advocating it.
I had always wondered why on earth there's so many Georgists were in favor of the income tax. Apparently Henry George Jr., right, Walt, was in favor of it. And last year or the year before, Alex, I think it was, gave us a talk and said, well, it was the tariff. That was the primary source of revenue by 1913. There really wasn't any land left to sell, federal land left to sell, so they said, well, the tariff is really a destructive force. It's not just paid at the expense of rent, it destroys productivity, whereas the income tax comes out of rent and probably doesn't discourage production very much compared to the tariff, which is such a destructive thing. And I thought, well, that makes sense, even though it really doesn't discourage land speculation the way it does. And I suppose that the amendment you proposed is necessary because landlords, even though you could tax the actual rent, income from land, you couldn't tax the land itself.
Yeah, we have to convince enough voters of this. In fact, in the 1880s and 1890s, the main difference between the Republican and Democratic parties was that the Republicans wanted higher tariffs, more tariffs on industry, and the Democrats, which were dominant in the South, the agricultural South, they wanted lower tariffs. And this tariff wars, I think Donald Trump has been renewing the tariff wars. He wants tariffs as a Republican president, and the Democrats want to have
freer trade,
global economy, international cooperation.
Thank you. Who's
Well,
next?
some of them, there's also the Bernie Sanders.
Come on. Come on up here.
Okay.
Ed,
I'll be quick.
all right. When the Georgia says I'll be quick, don't hold your breath.
I've been working on a new version of an old joke. I'm not going to give you the new version yet because I haven't really figured out if it's funny. But the old version, maybe you can give me some hints on how I can change this. Some of you may know this old joke. This banker dies, and surprisingly, he's greeted at the gates of heaven by an angel. And the angel says, "Welcome to heaven." And he says, "Well, where am I going to be?" And she says, well, hop into this limousine and I'll take you to the place where you're going. So they're driving through heaven, and they come to a stop, and there's a van filled with nuns. And they watch the van that pulls out in front of them, and the van pulls off into this little area, and it's a bunch of townhouses. And so they get out, they go into the townhouses, and the guy's sitting there, "Oh, good, nuns are going to the townhouses. Well, that's not great, but maybe they'll have a place for me that's not too bad." So they drive up a little further into heaven, and they stop at another place, and a limo comes along with a priest in it. And he's watching, and the priest, they pull into a cul-de-sac, and there's a little cottage there, a whole bunch of cottages, and a whole bunch of priests walking around these cottages. I mean, they're like a second home, nothing big. And the priest gets out, and the guy says, "Oh, geez, townhouses for nuns, but just a cottage for a priest. What the heck are they going to do with me?" So they drive along a little further into heaven. They come up to this gated area, and the gates open. And there's this long driveway. At the end of this driveway is this giant mansion. And he says to the angel, "What are we doing here?" He says, "Well, this is where you're going to be." He says, "I don't get it." He said, "You put the nuns in these little townhouses, the priest and the cottage, and you're giving me this mansion? What's the deal? And the angel says, well, we get nuns and priests up here all the time. You're the first banker we've ever had. So, how could that joke be modified for George's?
Well, it could be modified for landlords. Worked pretty well for them,
Well,
wouldn't
that's a
it?
good idea, Mike, for landlords.
What you need is a sign.
Yes, wait, I thought Nick wanted to go.
I've got to import a sign. You
Let's
get
see.
this.
Don't hold back. Get to work on it, David.
Don't be bashful, but Joe, we'll,
Some,
we've got time for two more.
brief reply.
Joe, you want to be one, and if you want to be the other one, fine, unless Wayne Looney's going to steal the show. You want to?
All right.
All right, so then you'll be next then.
Okay.
I'll be short. Just
Yeah, I've heard that before too.
Well, the 13th Amendment, one thing is overlooked. It came to light when I read a book about the history of Prohibition. The passage of the 16th Amendment made the experiment with Prohibition possible because there were, the federal government did get a lot of excise taxes from the production and sale of alcohol. And of course with Prohibition, that revenue source would dry up. So we had an income tax to replace it.
Oh, how about that?
Well, Ed's joke reminded me of another joke where a Protestant minister was visiting his Catholic priest friend and was in the rectory and said, boy, this is a beautiful big house. And he says, compared to what I have, it's very luxurious. And the priest says, well, you have the better halves, we have the better quarters. But actually, one of the things I did want to talk about is I came to understand the principle of Georgism, I guess, not through religious principles actually, though it for me now it's the most important thing, but I actually came to the idea of incentives. And when I first heard the idea, even when I was 8th grade or so, about we don't tax the building because we discourage, we provide the wrong incentive. So to me, this is one of the things we ought to talk about is the idea of incentives of the land value tax versus tax on labor. And in particular, when we see areas that are more desirable, more important, more have, for instance, like Baltimore, a place which is in desperate needs, where the land value is probably lower than it would be in a more prosperous place. And in particular, I think of the eastern part of North Carolina where the land value is very low, where there's high unemployment. And of course, where the land value is low, the tax would be lower. And so we then provided incentive for industry, for business, for commerce to come in. Now, that's not going to overcome other barriers that may be there, but it's going to provide one more incentive to bring business to those lower employment areas.
Still 5 more minutes.
I'll take
All right.
I can just say from here, I just want to say good morning, everyone.
Good morning. All right, wait, Justice.
Let me just say,
Oh. Wait a minute. He was walking this way.
oh, is he up?
But there's probably time. I don't know how long he's gonna take. I've got 6 minutes left. Why don't you stand up there
There was
until you're
some
ready
talk-
to go?
Hello?
Okay.
There was some talk about having action items, when we finish the conference or move on. And so I just have one suggestion. It's not the action item, but we should have a list of 200, 300 organizations around the country and the world that have similar goals. We need to identify their goals, how they match up with our goals of economic justice, social justice, environmental justice, and find out who they are and just listen to them and just find out who these people are and how we might make connections with them. But it's just maybe a group of people can just do that as a project, is to identify as much as we can. And it's probably been done before, but it could be done again.
Well, you started.
I had a friend who I met through my sister who was a married old nun. He was a a missionary priest, and he was from Baton Rouge. And annually, he came back from Taiwan, where he had his school. And I used to go down once in a while when he was there. And so this one year I was there, and I was looking at the plantations around Baton Rouge and New Orleans. And you can go on tours because there's some old, they preserve some of these old plantations. And then Ed's joke reminded me of this. So I'm coming to this plantation, and there's the long driveway, the trees, the big manor house, and we're walking along, and there's this little house over among the trees. I said, what's that? Well, they said, that's a dispensary. And I said, you mean they had like a resident doctor? No, that was for the slaves. So not all slave owners were Simon Legree's, I guess, because at least they saw that it was in their best
Well,
interest
they had
to
an
keep the
investment,
slaves
they wanted to
healthy,
keep them
right?
healthy.
Yeah, right.
We still got 5 minutes, and we've got one more contestant. Kecia Gonzalez, for anybody who doesn't remember her.
Well, I just want to thank you for, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity, CGO, of promoting this event. It was really has a lot of positive things for me, and I appreciate you all and your experience, and even you were silent when I was talking. I realized probably that I was bringing news to you because even though we promote land value taxation and these reforms to better country, the financial situation in different countries, the aim for you is the United States. So I watched the news because I was talking about foreigner country, Honduras. And brainstorming with Alana, I told her that now that I see some opportunity for myself to try to arrange for a conference where we can expose the situation of political forum about Central America in New York probably, or in some other place where I could find the venue, because it has to do with the United States and in the foreign policies application to the neighboring countries. All in the South, United States has been directly involved. In Central America, we were a say of the trainings given in the School of Americas, or military came here and been trained, and the results and repression in those countries is result of that. And I guess you are not aware. There is a group of progressive persons that will fight, but how to influence the government.
We're trying not to think about it.
All things, but the repercussions in that country, especially Honduras, yesterday was a very limited time for me to explain, but in the last, after the coup d'etat had worsened, and we came out of an election that it was totally fraudulent, and the government right now is controlling everything, the three legislative, judiciary, there is no justice in Honduras right now. And I'm not changing it, but I'm raising caution about, and that's what I said, that Henry George is kind of solution to raise. I hear you saying that it wasn't the social part, the social issue, but the incentives in application. In my country, it's about raising consciousness, because people think they are not out of hope and they think there is nothing else to do. The Hondurans' attitude is say, oh, let's wait until God changes this, and this is not the way. They have to act, and even though I'm a loner right now, but I can come to you to be part of this. Thank you.
Thank you. That's basically the end of the open mic for today and for this conference, and I want to thank everybody who's come and participated in it. And I really didn't have to worry about the timing because everybody was pretty much within, either ran out of steam in 5 minutes or respected the rule. Thank you very much. See you next year.
Thank you.